The largest land mammal found in North America. Wood bison were declared extinct in the 1900s until a tiny herd was found.
In June of 1980, on a dirt airstrip near Nahanni Butte, in the remote southwestern corner of Canada's Northwest Territories, wildlife officials unloaded 28 wood bison from a transport plane and released them into a valley that had not held a single wild bison in roughly 100 years. It was an enormous gamble. These animals were being sent into thick boreal forest and river valley terrain, hundreds of kilometers from the nearest road, based on nothing more than a careful bet that the land could still support them, decades after the species had vanished from it entirely. What happened to that small founding herd over the following 4 decades would turn into one of the most successful wildlife reintroductions in North American history, and to understand why it mattered so much, you first need to understand just how close wood bison came to disappearing altogether. Wood bison are the largest land mammal in North America, larger even than their more famous cousins, the plains bison that once roamed the Great Plains in the tens of millions. A mature wood bison bull can weigh more than 1,000 kilograms and stand nearly 2 meters tall at the shoulder. Historically, they ranged across a vast stretch of the continent's northern forests, from Alaska down through the Yukon and into northern Alberta, moving through willow meadows and river valleys in numbers that early explorers described as staggering. That abundance collapsed with brutal speed once European hunters and traders arrived in the region in large numbers during the 1800s. Wood bison were killed for meat, hides, and sport on a scale the population could not sustain, and by the end of the 19th century, the subspecies had been pushed to the edge of extinction. Population estimates from that era are rough, but naturalists recorded numbers dropping from the low hundreds down to as few as 50 individuals in some counts, a level so low that many assumed the wood bison, as a distinct subspecies, was simply finished. A small population managed to survive in and around what is now Wood Buffalo National Park, straddling the border of Alberta and the Northwest Territories. But that surviving population came with a serious complication. In the 1920s, in an effort to boost bison numbers overall, the Canadian government transferred thousands of plains bison into the park, and the two subspecies interbred extensively, along with the introduction of diseases like bovine tuberculosis and brucellosis that plains bison carried with them. The genetically distinct wood bison, and its disease-free status, was now under threat from within its own last stronghold. It helps to understand what actually separates wood bison from the plains bison. Most people picture when they hear the word buffalo. Wood bison are taller at the shoulder, carry a distinctive high, squared hump directly above their front legs, and have a thicker, darker coat suited to the cold boreal forest and river valley habitat they evolved in, as opposed to the open grassland plains bison are adapted to. Genetically and physically, the two are recognized as separate subspecies of the same species, bison, and wildlife managers in Canada have gone to considerable lengths to keep the two from interbreeding in the wild, since hybridization is exactly what nearly erased the distinct wood bison lineage back in the 1920s. In 1957, however, biologists surveying a remote, disease-free pocket of the park made a discovery that would change everything. A small, isolated herd of wood bison that had somehow avoided both the interbreeding and the disease outbreaks affecting the rest of the park's population. This herd represented the last genetically pure, disease-free wood bison left anywhere on the continent. In 1965, conservationists captured 21 of these animals and relocated them to Elk Island National Park in Alberta, establishing a dedicated captive breeding herd whose entire purpose was to protect this remaining genetic lineage and eventually use it to re-establish wild populations elsewhere. That single decision, moving 21 disease-free wood bison to a protected breeding site in 1965, became the foundation for every wild wood bison reintroduction that followed. Every animal flown into the Nahanni Valley 15 years later, and every wood bison alive in the wild in Canada today, traces its ancestry back to that small founding herd. By 1980, the Elk Island breeding population had grown large enough, and researchers had identified suitable habitat far to the north, in the Liard River Valley near Nahanni Butte, remote boreal forest and river meadow terrain, that closely matched the wood bison's historic range and had been unoccupied by the species for roughly a century. The plan called for transporting 28 bison from Elk Island directly into this remote valley, a logistical challenge given the near-total absence of road access to the release site. The animals were moved by truck partway, then flown the final leg into Nahanni Butte, released directly into unfenced wilderness with no ongoing supplemental feeding and no fallback plan if the reintroduction failed. There was no way to predict with certainty how 28 animals, drawn from a managed captive herd, would fare navigating a boreal river valley, finding their own forage through the brutal subarctic winter and avoiding the predators native to the region, including wolves that had not had to contend with bison in the area for a century. The 1980 release itself required a level of logistical planning that is easy to overlook decades later, moving 28 large, powerful animals hundreds of kilometers from a fenced breeding facility in central Alberta to an unfenced river valley in the far northwestern Northwest Territories meant sedating and crating animals that could weigh close to 1,000 kilograms each, trucking them as far as available roads allowed, and then completing the final leg of the journey by aircraft into a landing strip near Nahanni Butte, with no guarantee the animals would tolerate the transport, let alone thrive once released. Wildlife veterinarians and handlers involved in the project had limited precedent to draw on. Few reintroductions of an animal this large into terrain this remote had been attempted anywhere in North America up to that point. The early results were promising, though slow. Through the 1980s and into the 1990s, researchers conducted periodic aerial surveys to track the herd's progress, and the picture that emerged was one of quiet, steady growth. A count in 1995 recorded 64 bison. The following year found 78. By 1997, the survey recorded 107 animals, more than triple the original founding population, less than 2 decades after that first release. Conservation officials, encouraged by these results, decided to reinforce the population further, rather than simply let it grow on its own. In March of 1989, an additional 12 wood bison were released near Nahanni Butte, supplementing the original group. Then, in 1998, a much larger release sent 59 more wood bison north of Fort Liard, expanding the herd's range and adding fresh genetic diversity from the same Elk Island source population. The combined effect of the original release and these 2 supplemental additions produced results that stunned even the biologists who had been tracking the herd for years. A 2004 aerial survey estimated the population at 403 animals. A follow-up survey in 2011 found 431, a similar figure suggesting the population had stabilized at a healthy, sustainable level. Then came the number that genuinely surprised researchers. A 2017 survey estimated the Nahanni wood bison population at 960 animals, more than 30 times the size of the original 28 bison flown in 37 years earlier. Today, wood bison from this reintroduced population range across an enormous stretch of territory, from the original release site near Nahanni Butte, along the Liard River Valley, into northeastern British Columbia, and up into the Yukon, occupying river islands, sandbars, and meadow habitat their ancestors had not used in living memory. Because this population descends entirely from the disease-free Elk Island herd, it remains free of the bovine tuberculosis and brucellosis that still infect wood bison populations elsewhere in the Wood Buffalo National Park area, making it one of the cleanest, healthiest wild bison populations left on the continent and a critical genetic reservoir for the subspecies as a whole. The story since 2017 has been more complicated and worth being honest about. A 2021 survey found the Nahanni population had declined to 544 animals, down considerably from the 2017 high. Wildlife managers in the Northwest Territories have noted that wood bison populations across the region tend to fluctuate significantly over time, shaped by disease exposure, severe winters, predation pressure, and periodic harvest quotas set for local indigenous communities in Fort Liard and Nahanni Butte, who hold treaty rights to hunt a limited number of bulls each year. A thriving wild population does not mean a permanently fixed one, and researchers continue monitoring the herd closely by boat survey each summer when bison gather on the sandbars and gravel islands along the Liard River. Even accounting for that more recent decline, the core achievement remains extraordinary. 28 bison, flown into a remote valley that had not supported a single wild bison in roughly a century, grew, with 2 modest supplemental releases along the way, into a population that at its peak approached 1,000 animals ranging freely across 3 Canadian jurisdictions. It stands today as one of the clearest success stories in large mammal reintroduction anywhere in North America, built not on a single dramatic gesture, but on a careful chain of decisions stretching back to 1957. The discovery of one disease-free herd, the choice to protect and breed it in isolation, and, 15 years later, the willingness to bet that a landscape empty of bison for a century could still remember how to hold them. There is also an ecological argument for why re-establishing wood bison in the Nahanni Valley mattered beyond simply saving a subspecies. Large grazing animals like bison function as what ecologists call a keystone species, meaning their presence shapes the surrounding ecosystem far out of proportion to their numbers. Bison wallowing behavior, where animals roll in dirt to coat themselves and deter insects, creates small depressions that collect rainwater and often develop into distinct microhabitats supporting different plant and amphibian species than the surrounding land. Their grazing patterns keep certain grass and sedge meadows open rather than allowing them to become overgrown, benefiting other wildlife that depend on that open meadow habitat. And their movement across the landscape disperses seeds over long distances, much like the horses in Xinjiang's Kalamili Reserve. Reintroducing bison to the Nahanni Valley was never only about the bison. It was about returning one of the region's key ecological engineers to a landscape that had been missing it for a century. The reintroduction has also mattered directly to the indigenous communities of Fort Liard and Nahanni Butte, who hold treaty harvesting rights over the herd, and have been involved in monitoring the population for decades, tracking its numbers by boat survey each summer when bison gather along the gravel bars of the Liard River. A limited annual harvest quota, currently set at 7 bulls for the Nahanni herd, allows these communities to exercise a traditional practice their ancestors would have relied on generations before wood bison disappeared from the valley in the first place, a practice made possible again only because of the population's recovery. Wood bison reintroduction efforts have not stopped at Nahanni. Similar programs have since established smaller herds elsewhere in northeastern British Columbia, drawing on the same Elk Island source population, and further south, Parks Canada has separately reintroduced plains bison into Banff National Park, where a small founding herd released by helicopter in 2017 has already begun uncovering the bones and wallows of ancestors that grazed the same valleys more than a century earlier. Different subspecies, different valleys, but the same underlying pattern, a species pushed to the edge of extinction by 19th century hunting, preserved through captive breeding by a small number of committed conservationists, and returned, cautiously and deliberately, to landscapes that had gone a century without them. Protecting the disease-free status of the Nahanni herd, along with a second disease-free population, known as the Mackenzie herd, established northwest of Great Slave Lake in 1963, has required an unusual and somewhat drastic ongoing management tool. Wildlife officials in the Northwest Territories maintain what is called a bison control area, a buffer zone of land separating the disease-free Nahanni and Mackenzie populations from the much larger but disease-infected wood bison population living in and around Wood Buffalo National Park to the east, where bovine tuberculosis and brucellosis have persisted since the plains bison introductions of the 1920s. Any bison found within this control zone are presumed to be carrying disease and are removed, a harsh but deliberate policy designed to prevent the two clean populations descended from that original 1965 Elk Island herd from ever being compromised the way the parent population once was. If stories like this one about the careful, decades-long work of bringing a species back to a landscape it had disappeared from are the kind of thing you want more of, subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.